I know the exact moment I stopped being an archivist. It was not when the 11 worlds went silent. It was not when the casualty figure was confirmed. 4,117,411, and I had to read it 3 times before the number resolved into anything I could hold. It was not even when Director Hale called me into the deep room beneath Meridian Station and spread the Vauren files across the table between us, all 143 years of them, and I saw for the first time what they had actually been doing up there in the dark. It was later. It was when I saw how they had labeled it. Scheduled clearance event, Agricultural Sector 7 Voss. That was my name in the header. They had used my family's name for an agricultural sector without knowing it was a name, because to the Vauren Cartographic Authority, the human worlds had no names. They had grid designations, they had soil composition ratings and water table assessments and atmospheric pressure, variance tables and population density, estimates accurate to within 2%. They had 143 years of the most thorough planetary survey ever conducted in this arm of the galaxy, and they had used none of it to understand us. They had used it to price us. The sector designation was a coincidence. I know that. The Vauren worked by coordinate grids, and the grid that covered the Heron Passage agricultural belt happened to fall in a range their catalogers had marked Voss 7. A filing convention, nothing more. But I looked at scheduled clearance event. Agricultural Sector 7 Voss and I felt something close, go in me very quietly, like a relay clicking off. And I understood that whatever I had been before, an analyst, a researcher, a woman who spent her working hours reading other species' records, I was now something else. I was the person who was going to read every one of those files, every entry, every survey log and coordinate notation and population estimate and resource valuation, all of it. And then I was going to help write the answer. The Vauren Cartographic Authority had been operating in human space since the Concordat of Settling 143 years before the glassing. We knew they were there. We had treaties with them. We had reciprocal survey arrangements and navigation beacon sharing agreements, and a dozen other instruments of the kind of bureaucratic cordiality that makes civilizations feel safe. The Vauren were map makers. They had been making maps of this arm of the galaxy for longer than humanity had been reaching for the stars. And they charged for the use of those maps, and the galaxy paid, because the Vauren maps were extraordinarily accurate. We paid too. For 143 years, we paid the Vauren Cartographic Authority a licensing fee for navigation data, and in return, their survey vessels moved through human space on registered flight paths. And we thought we understood the arrangement. I had been studying the Vauren for 11 years when it happened. Not because anyone had suspected them of anything. There was no counterintelligence angle to my work. I was a senior archivist at the Combined Cultural Studies facility on Meridian Station, and the Vauren were simply one of the more interesting subjects in that arm of the field. An old, patient species of hexapod surveyors who communicated in a dense mathematical notation that most xenolinguists found impenetrable and I found beautiful. I had published 4 papers on Vauren cataloging methodology. I had corresponded, through the formal exchange channels, with 3 Vauren catalog masters. I had once, at an academic convocation on Terrace Prime, been in the same orbital station as a Vauren survey delegation, though we had not met directly, because the Vauren did not meet directly with the species they were assessing. They observed from a remove. I should have found that significant. I did not find it significant. I found it consistent with their methodology. The Vauren surveyed. They did not engage. I put it down to professional discipline and wrote a footnote about it in my 3rd paper. 11 years, 4 papers, 1 footnote. The 11 worlds was silent on the 14th of March, not sequentially. Simultaneously, within a window of approximately 40 minutes, which is the light travel variance across the Heron Passage agricultural belt at its widest extent. All 11 agricultural worlds, all 11 populations, all 11 sets of surface communications, cargo manifests, navigation beacons, weather relay stations, emergency distress channels, silent. The first reports reached Meridian Station 6 hours later, when a cargo hauler making a standard approach to Heron 4 found debris where a planet's orbital traffic should have been and broadcast on every frequency it had. I was in my office when the station alerts began. I remember thinking, and this is the small, specific, shameful thought I have carried for a long time. I remember thinking that there had been a navigational incident, a collision, something regional. I remember pulling up the sector map and seeing Heron 4 flagged and thinking, one world, a tragedy. And then the flags began appearing across the board, one after another, each one a pinpoint of amber light in the Heron Passage. And I counted them, and I kept counting, and by the time I had reached 8, I was standing, though I did not remember standing, and by 11, I was holding the edge of the desk with both hands. The Combined Cultural Studies facility was not a military installation. We did not have the response infrastructure of a fleet command. What we had was a very large archive and a staff of analysts who were extraordinarily good at reading other species' records. Director Hale cleared the public access tiers and locked us into the deep archive within the hour. And for the first 36 hours, we did what we were trained to do. We read. The Sarathi consolidation was identified within 12 hours. The weapon signature was theirs, a particular configuration of directed gravitic stress that the Sarathi had been developing for 80 years and had deployed twice before against non-signatory worlds on the outer edge of their territory. Both previous deployments had been noted, protested through the relevant bodies, and ultimately accepted as the Sarathi's prerogative under the Outer Reach non-interference protocols, because the worlds in question had not been in treaty space, and the populations had been small. Heron Passage was well within treaty space. Heron Passage held 11 worlds and 4,117,000 people. The Sarathi were known, the Sarathi were documented. The Sarathi were, in the language of the formal diplomatic record, a difficult interlocutor with a history of territorial maximalism. They were not, by any prior analysis, capable of coordinating a simultaneous 11-world strike without precise targeting data gathered over a period of decades. That was what Director Hale put on the table in the deep room 40 hours after the silencing. That was when he spread out the Vauren files. The Vauren Cartographic Authority maintained a primary archive at Vauren Station Keth, a surveying platform in deep interstitial space between the Vauren home systems and the outer edges of human surveyed territory. The archive was not secret. It was a working repository of navigational data, and its existence was well established in the public record. What was not established in the public record was the internal classification system the Vauren had developed over the past 2 centuries for a subset of their survey work. We had an informant. I will not discuss that further, because those details belong to a different record, one that will remain sealed for a long time. What Director Hale placed on the table were 27 compressed data files extracted from Vauren, Station Keth's secondary archive, the one that did not appear in the licensing manifests, the one whose existence we had not known about. And he placed them in front of me because I was the person at Meridian Station who could read Vauren, cataloging notation without assistance. I read for 14 hours straight. I will try to describe what the Vauren files contained because the nature of them matters. They were not intelligence assessments in any human sense of the term. They were not military targeting packages or threat analyses or strategic recommendations. They were exactly what the Vauren Cartographic Authority said it produced: surveys. Extraordinarily detailed, extraordinarily patient, extraordinarily precise surveys of every inhabited human world in the Heron Passage, the Corsair Belt, the Mid-Reach sectors, and 14 additional human-settled zones stretching across a survey area that covered, I eventually calculated, roughly 60% of all human space. Every world, every settlement, every agricultural station and orbital platform and deep space relay. Population density figures updated annually. Atmospheric composition profiles. Water and mineral resource assessments. Infrastructure mapping accurate to within 50 meters. And in a data field, the Vauren had labeled in their notation system as something I initially translated as clearance potential. A figure that I eventually understood to be a rating of how completely and efficiently a given world could be, stripped of its biosphere and rendered available for resettlement by another party. They had been surveying us for 143 years, not because they wanted to know us, because someone else wanted to know how to erase us. The subcontracting agreement was in the files. The Vauren did not conduct their secondary surveys for free. the Sarathi consolidation had been paying the Vauren Cartographic Authority, through a series of intermediary accounts in the Outer Reach Free Trade Zone, for ongoing human space assessments since the period I call the beginning, 143 years earlier. The amount was substantial by any measure. The Vauren had been the best paid cartographers in this arm of the galaxy, and the Sarathi had been their best client. And for 143 years, the Vauren had produced the most thorough record of human civilization ever assembled, and had sold it, coordinate by coordinate, to the people who intended to use it as a demolition guide. The 11 worlds of the Heron Passage had been designated, in the Sarathi-facing version of the Vauren files, as Phase 1. The clearance potential ratings were among the highest in the dataset. Excellent. Agricultural soil, easy atmospheric processing, minimal orbital debris risk post-clearance. Ideal for resettlement. The Vauren had flagged them as priority targets in a separate notation layer, and the Sarathi had evidently agreed, because the glassing had proceeded exactly along the Vauren's recommended sequence, world by world within the 40-minute window, in ascending order of clearance potential rating. There was a Phase 2. There was a Phase 3. Sat in the deep room at Meridian Station, and I read about Phase 2 and Phase 3, and I understood that if the Sarathi had executed on schedule, we would have lost not 11 worlds, but 67. Nearly a third of all human-settled space, stripped in a series of coordinated strikes over the following 8 years, each phase timed to minimize our capacity to respond by targeting our food production, our manufacturing infrastructure, and our population centers in a sequence optimized by 143 years of Vauren survey data. The Vauren had filed a notes field in the Phase 3 documents. It was a standard administrative notation, a catalog master's summary of the expected timeline to completion. I have translated it many times, and I believe my translation is accurate. It read in full: subject civilization clearance estimated complete within 11.4 years of Phase 1 initiation. Barring significant deviation from modeled parameters, no further survey updates will be required after Phase 3. File can be closed at project completion. That was us. That was the entirety of humanity. A file that could be closed at project completion. I finished reading at hour 14. I sat for a while in the deep room with the lights at their working level and the ventilation running its low hum and the stack of 27 compressed files on the table in front of me. Director Hale came in and set his cup of something warm at my elbow and did not ask me anything. He waited. After a time, I said, "I want to be on the team that writes the response." He said, "I know. I've already submitted your secondment." I said, "All of it. Every world they surveyed, every grid designation, every file." He said, "Yes." I said, "I want them to use the same notation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll put that in the secondment notes." I picked up the cup. I drank. I did not feel anything in particular, which at the time I took for shock and later came to understand was simply the sensation of grief reaching a certain temperature and stabilizing there, solid and cold and very, very useful. The pale reckoning was not named by a committee. It was not named by a general or an admiral or a political authority. It was named, at least in the working record that I can speak to directly, by a logistics officer on the planning staff, a Commander Yeva Oren of the Fleet Marshalling Service, who needed a designation for the operational file she was creating and used the phrase she had written in her personal notes 3 days after the silencing. She said later, when someone asked, that she had not been trying to be poetic. She had been trying to be accurate. A reckoning is an accounting. It is the settling of what is owed. The Vauren had spent 143 years on their accounting. We were going to spend rather less time on ours. The fleet took 14 months to assemble. I want to be precise about that, because 14 months sounds like a long time, and it was not. It was the fastest major fleet marshalling in human military history to that point, and it was achieved by a planning process that had, from the first week, one unusual feature. It was being run in parallel with an archival analysis that I was leading, and the two processes were feeding each other in real time. The principle was simple, though the execution was not. The Vauren had spent 143 years cataloging us. Their methodology was meticulous. Their data was accurate. And their secondary archive, the one we had extracted, contained not just the survey data for human space, but the survey data the Vauren maintained for their own operational infrastructure. archive stations, survey relay platforms, data vaults. The administrative hubs of the Cartographic Authority's network. They were map makers. They mapped everything, including themselves. The Pale Reckoning's target list was built from Vauren files. Every Vauren Cartographic Authority installation in the operational record, every Sarathi fleet base, staging area, and resettlement preparation facility that appeared in the secondary archive's client-facing documents, every transit hub, every relay, every structure that had been part of the mechanism that produced Phase 1. The list was long. I worked on it for 14 months alongside Commander Oren, and I will say plainly that the work had a quality I had not anticipated. It was absorbing in the way that the best archival work always was, but with an additional dimension of purpose that I had never felt before in a professional context. Every entry I verified was a coordinate the Vauren had believed no one would ever trace back to them. Every installation I cataloged from their own records was a point in their network they had not thought to protect, because who would think to protect themselves from their own maps? The answer to that question turned out to be the people whose worlds had been rated for clearance potential. Commander Oren and I developed a working relationship over those 14 months that I think of now as one of the cleaner things from that period. She was a precise, unsentimental woman who had lost a sister on Heron 7, and she did not discuss this, and I did not ask, and we communicated almost entirely in the language of the operational file. Coordinates, fleet movement vectors, resupply chains, target classifications. We worked well together. We agreed on the notation system early. The Vauren cataloging notation used a 9-digit coordinate code with a 2-character status suffix. For active survey targets, the suffix was the Vauren characters I had been translating for 11 years as ongoing, a designation of continuing relevance. For completed surveys where no further work was required, the suffix was what I had always translated as archived, a closed file. For their clearance event targets, they used a 3rd suffix that I translated, after much deliberation, as scheduled. I proposed that the Pale Reckoning's target list use the same suffix system, adapted. Active targets, the ones the fleet had not yet reached, carried scheduled. Targets the fleet had processed would carry the Vauren archived suffix, not as mockery, not as a gesture, simply as the most accurate notation for the status of a completed entry. Commander Oren looked at the proposal for about 12 seconds. Then she approved it and moved on to the next item on her agenda. The target list, when it was complete, contained 412 entries. The Pale Reckoning was built around a force of 350,000 warships, drawn from 6 fleet commands, 12 reserve formations, and every combat-capable vessel the Colonial Defense Authority could put in space within the marshalling window. It was the largest force humanity had assembled since the early consolidation conflicts, and it was organized not as a battle fleet, but as a survey response team, which is a distinction that sounds small and is not. A battle fleet goes to fight. The Pale Reckoning went to close files. I watched it assemble from Meridian Station's observation deck during the final 2 weeks of the marshalling phase, when the forward elements were staging in the system's outer belt. I did not stand there for sentiment. I was there because the assembly order confirmed target assignment blocks, and I needed to verify the block assignments against my master list, and the observation deck had a better display resolution than my office terminal. But I looked up from the display more than once, at the actual ships, and I will say what I saw honestly. 350,000 warships in partial formation, at the far edge of a star system, catch the light in a way that is not precisely beautiful, but is very difficult to look away from. They do not gleam. The hull plating is too weathered for that, too marked by the small impacts and oxidation that all ships collect in service. What they do is accumulate light, starlight, the system primary's distant warmth, and hold it on thousands of hull surfaces simultaneously, so that the formation glows faintly against the dark in a way that resembles, at the wrong angle, a structured field of stars. I stood at the observation deck, and I thought about 143 years of patience. And I thought about what it takes to answer 143 years of patience, and I thought, this is what it takes. The fleet drew from 6 separate commands. I knew the composition well, because I had cross-referenced the target assignments against the fleet rosters To ensure that the ships responding to the Vauren's Heron Passage survey zone were drawn partly from the colonial defense formations that had been stationed in that sector. The ships that had received the silencers, first, that had dispatched the first recovery teams, that had sent medical vessels to debris fields where they found no one to treat. It had not been a hard argument to make to the planning staff. These were the crews that already understood, at a level below language, what they were part of. I had also made sure quietly that EF's Heron 4 was on the manifest. It was a destroyer, newly commissioned in the last months of marshalling, named under the convention that Commander Oren and I had worked out early in the planning phase. Ships named for the 11 worlds, carrying with them a designation that would appear in the Sarathi communications logs when the fleet arrived in their space, so that whatever else they received from us, they would receive the names of the worlds they had cleared. 412 targets, 350,000 ships, 14 months. We would be faster than they had been. That was the point. I was aboard EFS Meridian's answer for the transit to Vauren Station Keth. I had not expected to be aboard the command vessel. I had expected to be at a secondary analysis post, somewhere in the mid-fleet formation, processing confirmation signals as the operation proceeded. Commander Oren had other plans. She told me 3 days before departure that Fleet Admiral Kashia Mwangi had requested me on the bridge staff, not as a tactical advisor, as the person who could read what we found in real time and confirm that the archive was what we believed it to be before the Pale Reckoning acted on it. I had one conversation with Admiral Mwangi before we departed. It was brief. She was a tall, spare woman of the kind of age that has compressed everything unnecessary away, and she said 3 things to me. She said, "You've read all the files." I said that I had, she said. "Then you know what's in there better than anyone else on this ship." I said that I believed so. She said, "Good. I need someone who can tell me, when we arrive, whether what we find matches what they claim to have." And she went back to her other work, and I went to my assigned station, and we departed the next morning. The transit to Vauren Station Keth took 11 days. I spent most of those 11 days at the analysis station the ship's crew had prepared for me, a secondary console on the bridge's port tier, screened slightly from the main command space, with a high-resolution display running the Vauren archive notation in parallel with the operational file. I cross-referenced. I verified coordinates. I went through the secondary archive one more time, methodically, the way I had always worked, and I found 3 entries I had misclassified and corrected them, and I added 17 notations I had previously marked as uncertain and now felt confident enough to resolve, and I updated Commander Oren's target list accordingly. The bridge of EFS Meridian's answer was a quiet place during transit. The crew were professional and largely silent at their stations. Admiral Mwangi spent her hours at the central console or in the planning room aft of the bridge, and the junior officers did their work without being asked twice about anything. And the ship moved through the transit corridor at the pace the fleet dictated, steady and without hurry, because hurry was not the point. The Vauren had taken 143 years. We had taken 14 months. We were not going to rush the last 11 days. On the 9th day, I found the Heron Passage surveys. I had seen them before, of course. I had read them in the first 14 hours at Meridian Station, but I had not, in that first reading, been calm enough to absorb the detail. Now I was calmer, or at least colder, and I read them properly. The Vauren had first surveyed Heron 4 in the year that, by my family's reckoning, my grandmother had been born on that world. She had been born on Heron 4 in the spring of its calendar. She had lived there until she was 23, when she had moved to the Corsair Belt for work. She had never gone back, though she had talked about it all through my childhood. The particular quality of the light in the agricultural districts, amber in the mornings, white-blue at midday, the smell of the harvest processing facilities, which she described as warm and slightly sweet, like grain toasted at low heat. The Vauren survey of Heron 4 from the year of my grandmother's birth described the agricultural districts as high-yield biosphere zones with efficient solar capture characteristics. It gave the population of the settlement my grandmother had been born in as 14,600 and approximately 20. It noted the settlement's infrastructure with characteristic Vauren precision. the processing facilities, the transport grid, the water reclamation system. It recorded everything my grandmother had grown up in, and it recorded it in the notation of a species that was measuring the cost of removing it. They had updated the survey annually. Every year, for 143 years, a Vauren survey vessel had passed through the Heron Passage on its registered flight path and had updated the population figures and the infrastructure assessments and the clearance potential ratings. I followed the updates through the file year by year, and I watched the settlement my grandmother had been born in grow from 14,620 to a city of 230,000, with an expanded processing infrastructure and 3 generations of additional construction, and the Vauren noted every addition in their standard notation and updated the clearance potential rating accordingly. And the rating never went down, because the more we built, the more there was to clear. I sat at the analysis console for a long time. I looked at the entry. I thought about my grandmother, who had died before the silencing, and I thought about the people in that city, the 230,000, who had been there on the 14th of March, who had been in that valley that smelled of warm grain, going about the accumulation of their lives. And I felt something I will describe only as the final solidification of something that had been solidifying for a long time. I added a notation to the Heron 4 survey record in the Vauren archive. In their own notation system, using the standard administrative formatting of a catalog master's annotation, I wrote, "Entry reviewed and confirmed. Clearance potential assessment verified accurate. No further survey updates required." I gave it the archived suffix. Then I closed the entry and went back to work. Vauren Station Keth appeared on the bridge sensors at 0314 ship time, 11 hours before the scheduled arrival window. I was awake. I had not been sleeping well, which I mention only because it meant I was at my station when the first contact readings came in, and I was therefore present for the 12-hour approach phase in its entirety, which is not something I had anticipated, and which I am, on balance, glad of. The station was large. I had known its dimensions from the archive. The Vauren surveyed their own infrastructure with the same thoroughness. They applied to everything else. But knowing the numbers and seeing the sensor silhouette were different experiences. Vauren Station Keth was a disk structure nearly 40 kilometers across, with a central archive column and 17 survey vessel docking arrays extending from the rim. It had been operational for 212 years. It carried a staff complement of approximately 800 Vauren catalogers, administrators, and technical personnel. It contained in its archive column the master copy of every survey the Vauren Cartographic Authority had conducted in this arm of the galaxy over the past 2 centuries. It contained the files on all 67 worlds the phase schedule had targeted. It contained the subcontracting agreement. It contained the payment records and the clearance potential ratings, and the Phase 1 designation documents with their scheduled clearance event headers. It contained somewhere in its archive column the record for Agricultural Sector 7 Voss. Admiral Mwangi ordered fleet formation at 060. The Pale Reckoning had been in transit, spread across a substantial volume, the way any force of that size must transit, distributed, to avoid the navigational hazards that concentrated mass creates at speed. The formation order brought it together, and I watched that process on the bridge display from my port-tiered station. And I will say it plainly. 350,000 warships assembling into operational formation is not a sight that translates into language easily. It was not loud. In space, nothing is loud. But it was enormous, and it was organized, and it moved with the methodical precision of a process that knew exactly what it intended to do and had calculated the most efficient path to doing it. The fleet filled the sensor display. The Vauren station sat in the center of the display, and the fleet surrounded it, and the numbers were not even close. I thought about their notation. I thought about clearance potential. Admiral Mwangi waited until full formation was confirmed before she opened a channel. The Vauren received the hail. I know this because the communications officer confirmed a carrier signal return. The Vauren simply did not respond. This was, I thought, consistent with their methodology. They did not meet directly with the species they were assessing. They observed from a remove. They had spent 143 years observing us from a remove. And perhaps they thought that if they maintained that professional discipline now, the surveying platform they were on would be treated as a neutral facility, the way their survey vessels had always been treated under the licensing agreements. They had perhaps not considered that the licensing agreements were no longer in force. They had approximately 11 minutes to observe. The Admiral gave the order at 0814, ship time. I watched the sensor feed. I did not look away. I had decided in the weeks before departure that I was going to watch all of it, every entry on the target list, and not look away from any of it. Because the looking away was a luxury that 4,117,000 people had not had, and I did not feel entitled to it. The Vauren station's structural integrity readings began deteriorating at 0815. The archive column, which the Vauren's own survey data had identified as the station's primary load-bearing structure, was engaged first. By 0817, the docking arrays had separated from the rim. By 0820, the archive column had fragmented. By 0831, Vauren Station Keth had been reduced to a debris field measurable in fragments, the largest of which was a section of the rim disk approximately 800 meters across, tumbling slowly away from the engagement site on a trajectory that would carry it into deep interstitial space. The archive was gone. The catalog masters were gone. The 143-year record of human space in its primary repository was gone. The communications officer logged it as target neutralized in the operational record. I went to the Vauren archive on my console. Our copy, the extracted secondary archive, which we had preserved because we needed it to build the target list, and found the entry for Vauren Station Keth and gave it the archive suffix. Then I found the next entry on the target list and confirmed its coordinates. We did not move against the Sarathi immediately. This was Admiral Mwangi's decision, and I believe it was correct, though I understand why some people disagreed at the time. The argument for delay was this. The Pale Reckoning had been built to respond to both the Vauren and the Sarathi, but the Vauren were the enablers and the Sarathi were the executors, and the operational plan called for clearing the Vauren network first. All of it, every archive station, every survey relay, every data vault, before turning to the Sarathi consolidation. The reasoning was not sentimental, it was practical. The Vauren secondary archive contained data on human space that, if it survived and remained available to any other party, represented a continuing risk. The operational plan closed that risk before addressing the Sarathi, because the Vauren network was dispersed across a larger operational area, and the Sarathi fleet, once alerted, would be more difficult to engage on our terms. The argument for moving on the Sarathi first was that every day they were not being engaged was a day they might launch Phase 2. Admiral Mwangi said, Phase 2 requires the Vauren coordinate data. We are removing the Vauren coordinate data. The Sarathi cannot execute Phase 2 without targeting data, and in 72 hours there will be no Vauren archive from which to retrieve it. She said this once. She did not repeat it. The Pale Reckoning spent 19 days clearing the Vauren Cartographic Authority's operational network. I read each target confirmation as it came in. I logged each one with the archive suffix. The 19 days developed a rhythm that I found, and I have thought about this word carefully. Clarifying. Not satisfying in the way some people seem to expect when they ask me about this period. Not pleasurable, but clarifying. There is a kind of work that, done with precision and care, produces in the worker a sense of alignment, of the action and the purpose being the same thing without gap or friction. I had felt it before in my archival work when a long research project finally cohered and the files resolved into a clear structure. I felt it during those 19 days in a different register, but recognizably the same quality. The Vauren had built their network over 2 centuries. We were moving through it in 19 days, one node at a time, and every confirmation that came back told me the same thing. The map they made of us was being unmade, entry by entry, in the same methodical spirit in which it had been built. Entry by entry, the archive suffix applied. The Vauren network proved on engagement to be exactly what their own files had described. Survey relay stations, automated or lightly staffed, regional data vaults, heavier structures with marginally better defensive systems, none of which had been designed to withstand serious engagement because the Vauren Cartographic Authority had never needed to defend themselves from serious engagement. They were a cartographic service. They operated under the protection of every treaty in the arm because every major power used their navigation data. The pale reckoning's presence at each installation produced, in the communications logs I reviewed afterward, a consistent pattern. The Vauren acknowledged the contact signal, did not respond to hails, and then, in a notation I found in 17 separate after-action reports, transmitted a standard licensing fee schedule to the approaching fleet. Even at the end, they were still trying to bill us for the maps. On the 14th day, we processed a survey relay station that the Vauren files described as the first installation from which the Heron Passage agricultural worlds had been surveyed 143 years earlier. The station was automated. It carried no crew. It was a data relay point, a node in the network, and its destruction was operationally routine. A 2-minute action requiring minimal fleet resources. I looked at the sensor feed for a while before logging the confirmation. I thought about what data had passed through that relay, what coordinates, what clearance potential ratings, what annual population updates year after year as the settlements in the Heron Passage grew and the rating stayed the same and the Sarathi payment arrived and the Vauren filed the confirmation and nothing at all, changed in the human worlds below because we did not know we were being watched. I thought about the first Vauren survey vessel that had passed through the Heron Passage 143 years ago, running its standard flight path under the reciprocal survey agreement, its instruments recording the amber morning light, and the processing, facilities, and the water reclamation grid. I thought about the catalog master who had reviewed that first survey return and assigned the clearance, potential rating, and typed the initial entry, the same entry I had found with my family name in the sector header, and filed it and moved on to the next world in the sequence and thought nothing more of it, because it was simply a data point, another record in a long ongoing project, and the project was going well. That relay station had been the pipeline for 143 years of that project. We should have known we were being watched. Then I logged the confirmation, archived, next entry. On the 19th day, the last Vauren Cartographic Authority installation on the target list was cleared, and Commander Oren updated the operational file, and Admiral Mwangi ordered the formation shift for the transit to Sarathi space. I slept that night for the first time in a long time without difficulty. The Sarathi consolidation presented a different operational problem than the Vauren. The Vauren were surveyors. They were not a military power. Their installations were equipped with emergency point defense systems and minimal shielding, and they had nothing that could meaningfully challenge the Pale Reckoning's presence. The Sarathi were different. The Sarathi consolidation had been a mid-tier military power for 3 centuries, not dominant in this arm of the galaxy, not negligible, capable of sustained fleet operations, and, as they had demonstrated, coordinated planetary-scale weapons deployment. They had a standing fleet. They had fleet bases. They had a home system with orbital defenses and a command infrastructure that had been planning their expansion into human space for more than a century. None of this changed the operational calculation materially. The Pale Reckoning at 350,000 warships was a different order of magnitude from anything the Sarathi could bring to bear, and Admiral Mwangi's staff had spent 14 months working out the approach vectors and engagement sequences. But it meant that the engagement with the Sarathi would not have the clinical simplicity of the Vauren clearance. There would be resistance. There would be a battle at several of the Sarathi installations before there was an outcome. People would die on our side as well. That had been in the planning documents, that had been acknowledged, costed, accepted. I want to be honest about what I felt during the transit to Sarathi space. I have been asked about this many times, and I have given different answers at different times, and the most honest answer I can give now is this. I felt nothing I recognized as fear or doubt, and I felt nothing I recognized as excitement or anticipation. What I felt was something like the final pages of a very long document. The conclusion was not in doubt. The work was nearly done. There was a quality of finality, the correct word, I think, that I found neither distressing nor satisfying. It was simply what came next in the sequence. We crossed into Sarathi space on the 23rd day of the operation. The Sarathi had been watching us since the Vauren action. They knew what we were. They had been watching us for 143 years after a fashion. They had sent diplomatic signals during our transit. We had received them, and they had not been answered because Admiral Mwangi had reviewed the communication protocols at the start of the operation and had made a decision I want to describe accurately. She had said, "The Vauren spent 143 years telling us what they were doing, and we didn't know how to read it. So Sarathi spent 14 months telling us there were no survivors before we had confirmed otherwise, and they're telling us now that this is a misunderstanding. We have read everything they have told us. We are now providing our response." She did not answer the signals. The first Sarathi fleet contact came at a staging base designated in our operational file as Sarathi Installation, Vauren 14, a fleet base and resettlement preparation facility, the latter designation being the Sarathi's own term for a facility designed to receive colonists after a planetary clearance. The Vauren files had rated the Vauren 14 resettlement zone for a population intake of approximately 240,000 Sarathi settlers who would have moved into the Heron Passage worlds after Phase 1 clearance was complete. The installation was heavily staffed. It had been built for permanence. The Sarathi had been confident enough in the Vauren's phase schedule that they had already begun infrastructure work at Vauren 14, pre-positioning supply depots, habitat modules, the administrative framework of a resettlement program that expected to be operating within the decade. The Sarathi mounted a defense at Vauren 14. It lasted a little under 3 hours. I did not watch the tactical display during the engagement. That is not my expertise, and the bridge staff did not need me looking at their screens. I sat at my analysis console and prepared the archive confirmations, and waited. The sounds of the engagement, filtered through the ship's communication systems, were quiet and professional. The voices of officers doing their jobs, without drama, without exhortation. The bridge of EFS Meridian's answer was a calm place during those 3 hours. The Admiral stood at the center console and spoke when she needed to, and was silent when she didn't, and the fleet responded with the kind of precision that comes from 14 months of planning and 19 days of operational consistency. And at hour 3, the communications officer said, "Vauren 14 neutralized and the tactical display updated." I gave the installation the archived suffix. I thought about Heron Passage. I thought about 240,000 settlers who would have moved into the agricultural districts and found the soil prepared for them by a gravitic weapon at a cost of 4 million lives. And I thought about the smell of warm grain and the amber morning light and the survey, updates arriving at Vauren Station Keth year after year. I gave the resettlement facility its own additional notation. I wrote, in Vauren administrative format, below the standard archived suffix, "Resettlement intake capacity, no longer required." Then I moved to the next entry. There were 37 Sarathi installations on the operational target list. The Pale Reckoning processed them over 41 days. I will not describe each engagement individually. Some were resisted more than others. Some, the outer installations, the smaller bases, the relay hubs, were not resisted at all, either because they had no defense capability or because the Sarathi personnel at those installations had evacuated when they saw the scale of what was coming. The Pale Reckoning did not pursue evacuees. That was a policy decision that had been made in the planning phase, and I agreed with it. This operation had 412 specific targets, and it was going to close those 412 entries, and it was not going to become something other than that. The Vauren had been precise. We were going to be more precise. We lost 11 ships during the Sarathi engagements. Not at the smaller installations, but at the 3 major fleet bases where the Sarathi concentrated their remaining forces. The losses were not large, as a fraction of 350,000, which is a statement I find difficult to write, because the fraction does not mean anything to the crews of those 11 ships, or to the people who received the notification afterward. I knew 2 of the ships by name from the marshalling manifests. I looked them up in the operational file after the engagements, and I added their names to a separate document I had been maintaining since the start of the operation, a personal record. not part of the official archive, of the names of things the Pale Reckoning had cost us. On the 28th day, we reached the primary Sarathi fleet base at Consolidation Hub Vareth, the installation from which the Heron Passage strike had been ordered. The Vauren files had a notation for Vareth in their administrative records. It appeared as the destination for the Phase 1 authorization confirmation, the document the Sarathi High Command had transmitted to the Vauren Cartographic Authority when they approved the final targeting package. The document was dated 14 months before the silencing. Someone at Vareth had read the Vauren survey data, reviewed the clearance potential ratings for 11 agricultural worlds, reviewed the Phase 1 timeline, reviewed the payment schedule, and signed the authorization. I had read that authorization many times during the planning phase. It was 4 paragraphs in Sarathi administrative notation, receipt of the targeting package, approval of the second payment tranche, deployment authorization to the designated coordinates on the designated date, a logistics note about resettlement timelines. 4 paragraphs, 11 worlds, 4 million people. The person who signed it had probably spent less time on that document than I spent on any single entry in the target list. The operational file designated Vareth as Target 311. It was the most heavily defended installation on the list. The Sarathi had consolidated the bulk of their remaining fleet assets there in the weeks since Korriban 14, apparently concluding, correctly, that we were working through the list in a systematic sequence, and that Vareth would be reached eventually. They had used the intervening time to reinforce the orbital defense grid and to concentrate their combat vessels in a layered formation around the installation's core. The engagement lasted 9 hours. I will say this about those 9 hours. They were the longest stretch of the operation, and I was at my station for all of them, and the bridge of ES Meridian's answer remained what it had been throughout. A quiet, professional space where people did their work without theater. The Admiral managed the engagement with the same economy she brought to everything. At hour 4, when the communications officer reported that the Sarathi were transmitting, not to us, but on an open emergency frequency, what appeared to be a general distress call to any vessel in range. The Admiral noted the transmission, confirmed there were no vessels in range that were not already part of the Pale Reckoning, and returned to her other work. At the end of the 9th hour, Vareth was archived. I logged the confirmation. I looked at the entry in the operational file for a long time after logging it, longer than I had looked at any of the others. I thought about the person at Vareth who had signed the Phase 1 authorization. I thought about what they had seen when they signed it. Survey data, coordinate grids, clearance potential ratings, agricultural worlds in a passage of space they intended to inhabit, numbers in a column. I thought, they never came to see what they were buying the rights to erase. That was their professional discipline. They observed from a remove. I gave Vareth the archived suffix and moved to the next entry. We lost 11 ships in the Sarathi engagements, not at the smaller installations, which had either no meaningful defense or crews that had evacuated, but at the 3 major fleet bases where the Sarathi had chosen to concentrate and resist. The losses were not large as a fraction of 350,000, which is a statement I find difficult to write because the fraction does not mean anything to the crews of those 11 ships or to the people who received the notification afterward. I knew 2 of the ships by name from the marshalling manifests. I had verified their target block assignments personally and seen their names in the rosters and thought nothing remarkable about it. Because there is nothing remarkable to think when a name is a name and not yet a loss. Afterward, I added their names to a document I had been maintaining privately since the start of the operation. It was not part of the official archive. It had 2 columns, one for the 11 worlds, one for the ships. It did not try to balance them or compare them. It simply held them in the same place, in the same notation, because they belonged in the same record, and because someone had to keep the record, and in the absence of anyone more suitable, I was the person available. On the 40th day, we reached the 3 Sarathi home system orbital defense platforms. They were the final military targets on the list. The Pale Reckoning's presence in the Sarathi home system, 350,000 warships in formation, at the outer boundary of their planetary space, is something I saw only on the sensor display, not with my own eyes, and I will not attempt to describe it in terms I cannot verify. What I can say is that the numbers on the display were what they had always been, and the Sarathi orbital platforms had a combined defensive rating that the planning staff had assessed as requiring approximately 7% of the Pale Reckoning's engagement capacity to neutralize, and that assessment proved accurate. They were neutralized. I archived the entries. Then I updated the Vauren secondary archives file on the Sarathi Consolidation's operational infrastructure. The file had been maintained by Vauren catalogers for 143 years. I had been maintaining it in a different capacity for 14 months. I went through each entry one final time, each installation, each base, each facility, and confirmed the archive status. And when I reached the last entry, I wrote, below the standard suffix, in the Vauren administrative format, a final catalog master's notation. I wrote, survey complete, all entries verified and archived, file closed. I gave it today's date in the Vauren calendar system. Then I closed the archive. Admiral Mwangi transmitted to the Sarathi home world on the 41st day. The transmission was short. The Admiral was not a person who used more words than the situation required. She transmitted the full operational log of the Pale Reckoning, every target, every date, every archived entry, and she transmitted alongside it a single document that I had written during the final transit, which was a copy of the Vauren Phase 1 designation files, the ones that had classified Harran Passage as scheduled clearance events, with an annotation at the top that read, these were the files your contracted surveyors prepared for your use. We have reviewed them thoroughly. We are providing our response. The Sarathi homeworld was not on the target list. This was also Admiral Mwangi's decision, and I will explain it the way she explained it to me, privately, on the 42nd day. When the operation was complete and the fleet was beginning its stand down, she said, the Vauren surveyed us for 143 years and classified us as a clearance problem. The Sarathi acted on that classification. We had two options for what to say to the survivors. We could say nothing, leave them with the debris fields and let them draw their own conclusions. Or we could say something precise. I said, and the transmission is the precise thing. She said, the transmission says, we read your files. We understand your methodology. We have applied it. Every installation, every base, every facility that was part of the mechanism that produced Phase 1 archived. Your home world was not part of that mechanism. Your home world is noted in the Vauren files as a potential Phase 4 target had the clearances proceeded. We are not operating on a Phase 4 schedule. We are operating on the schedule defined by the specific harm you did. I thought about that for a moment. I said, it's a message about precision. She said, yes, it's a message that says we were precise. We did exactly what the harm required, no more and no less. And we have now demonstrated what our precision looks like with 412 entries in the operational file as the supporting documentation. She went back to her work. I went back to my station. I returned to Meridian Station 63 days after departure. The facility had changed in my absence, or I had changed, or both. And for a while, I stood in the outer corridor of the archive level and felt the difference without being able to name it precisely. Director Hale met me at the archive entrance. He looked older than he had 63 days earlier, which is a thing that probably reflected on me as much as on him. He said, how was it? Not as a pleasantry. As an actual question from a man who wanted an actual answer. I thought about how to answer. I thought about the sensor display and the archive suffix and the smell of warm grain that my grandmother had described. I thought about those 14,000 and approximately 20 people and the 230,000 they had become. I thought about the Vauren catalog master who had typed scheduled clearance event and the Sarathi administrator who had signed the Phase 1 authorization and the 11 worlds that had gone silent on the 14th of March, and the 19 days of the Vauren clearance, and the 41 days of the Sarathi engagement, and the 11 ships we had lost, and the document I had written at my private console with the names of things the operation had cost us. I said, conclusive. He nodded. He said, are you staying in archive work? I said, for now. There are things I want to write up properly. He said, the record. I said, the record. What I meant, And what I have spent the time since attempting to produce is this document, the full account, in the order I experienced it, of what the Vauren Cartographic Authority filed about us, and what the Pale Reckoning filed about them, and the relationship between those two archives. I have tried to be accurate. I have tried to use the right words for what things were. I have tried not to soften and not to exaggerate and not to make it into something cleaner or crueler than it was. I was an archivist for 11 years before the 14th of March. I am an archivist still. What I file is what I know. The Vauren spent 143 years keeping a record of us. They kept it meticulously and accurately and without anything that resembled understanding of what they were recording. They recorded our worlds and our numbers and our infrastructure, and they gave it all to the people who intended to use it as a clearance guide. And they labeled us as scheduled events, and they thought the file would close on our terms. The Pale Reckoning closed the file. 412 entries, verified and archived. They had watched us for 143 years, and they had seen resources, clearance potential, phase targets, numbers in a column. They never looked up from the column long enough to see what we were. That was the last thing they got wrong.